Growing a year's supply of food sounds like an overwhelming task, and it can be unless you break it down. So I'm going to be putting together a series of videos to share how I'm approaching it step by step, one crop at a time. And today we're growing onions. So onions, I think, are one of those unsung heroes in the kitchen. They were always used, but it's kind of behind the scenes, so we don't really think of them. As a wintertime vegetable, many of my soups and stews and casseroles start with dicing an onion. And I always use an onion when I'm roasting a chicken, and then of course in making stock. I also use onions in making things like a fajita mix or a tray of roasted vegetables. There's nothing better than caramelized onions to make a great gravy. And actually, a really great breakfast treat is, of course, the hash brown. In summertime, onions make a wonderful addition to any salad, be it whether you pop it in a potato salad or a pasta salad, or even just a green salad, which has radically changed by adding an onion. And then onions are also staple ingredients in many dips and condiments, if you think of your salsas and guacamoles, and even in garlic-based dips, or in toppings like in bruschetta or on a pizza. So I'm sure that I've convinced you now that this is a great crop to start with for building your pantry food supply. So let's get going. So today I'm going to be starting onions. I'm starting two types of onions. I'm going to be starting my zucchini shallots, and I'm going to be planting enough to provide shallots or onions for the entire year. I'm going to do them in two batches. These onions take about 90 to 120 days to be fully mature. So by starting now, that means I can get ahead of the season, and I'll be looking to harvest these in around mid-May. And then what I'm also going to do is plant a second batch after the height of the summer so that I can have a winter harvest. I'm also going to be planting spring onions today, also known as scallions or bunching onions. These have a growing length of about 70 to 84 days, so that's about 2.5 months. So if I start today indoors, mid-February, March, April, it should be around the same time, May, when I'm harvesting these. What I'm going to do though, because we like to use these fresh in salads and things, I don't want to plant too many all at once. I want to stagger my harvest dates. So I'm going to stagger the sowing dates and re-sow every 2 weeks so that I can have a continual harvest as we head from spring into summer. I like to pre-mix my growing medium in a large tote, so I'm going to mix up some potting soil here with some perlite, and I'm going to moisten the soil before I mix it so that it's easier to handle and easier to fill the trays. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to talk to you about getting your head around this idea of growing a year's supply of food. A large part of being successful with growing food for a year is planning it all out, and hopefully you have already seen my previous videos on planning your harvest, which shows how to keep a fail-safe planting calendar, and also my video on mapping out your garden design. If you haven't seen those, I will link them at the end of this video so you can go ahead and watch those when you are done here. The first step in growing any crop for a year is to think about how much of it you're going to need. And now I've just given you a long list of all the ways that you didn't even realize you were using onions. You can now think about how many onions you use per week. And once you know how many you use per week, you simply multiply that number by 52, and you'll come up with a number that you're going to need for the whole year. The great thing about growing onions is that they are a cool season crop, and so you don't actually have to grow them all at once. In fact, I find that it's much better if you divide that annual planting number in two and plan on planting 2 batches. If you start your first batch indoors around 12 weeks before the last frost date, and then with your second batch you can actually direct sow them in the ground, and that would be done about 6 weeks before your first winter freeze date. It's sort of a similar time to when you plant your garlic.
With all things, make sure you mark down your dates for sowing and transplanting and harvesting on your planting calendar so that you don't lose track.
So now I've got my plugs filled, I'm ready to go. So because onions are one of those seeds that you start early, I like to use these bigger plugs. And you can see that they've just got like a bit more depth to them compared to these tiny plugs. And what that means is it gives the seed or the seedling a little bit more space to grow, which means I don't have to transplant them so soon. For seeds that you start later indoors, about 8 weeks, these are fine, but because I'm sort of still between that 10 and 12 weeks prior to the last frost, I want to make sure that I'm not having to do too much transplanting. So we've got six packs, so I've got 36 that I'm going to start here. So with the shallots, because they're going to be about 12 weeks old by the time I plant them out, I'm going to go for one seed in each cell.
So onions are a bulb, and sometimes when we see a bulb, we think about planting a bulb and not necessarily starting from seed. But there are a good number of reasons to start from seed, and I'm going to tell you why. Firstly, starting from seed will invariably give you bigger onions and also a more successful harvest. And this is because the onion does not get interrupted in its growing cycle. Onion sets, which you often see people starting for an onion crop, they are actually small onion bulbs, and they are usually around a nickel size in diameter. They were grown from seed in the previous season, and sets are what you will find widely available from seed catalogs or garden centers, but typically they yield smaller onions and are more often used to produce green onions than larger bulb onions. Because sets are in the second year of the onion's life cycle, they are more likely to bolt, or that means they will grow a flower from the center of the bulb, which is not what you want. So starting onions from seed is going to avoid all of that trouble. It's also going to be less expensive, especially when you're wanting to grow a good number, like an annual supply. And lastly, you always will be able to find a wider variety of onions when you're starting from seed. Onions come in all shapes and sizes, and the Zucchini shallots that I'm starting today are a milder, sweeter tasting variety with a more tender pink flesh. So I find that they're more versatile in recipes for both summer and winter cooking. And so starting from seed will allow you access to these different varieties. Now that I've got all of the seeds planted in the soil, I'm going to give them a good spray with water, and spraying them every 2 to 3 days is good practice while you're waiting for them to germinate.
So with the bunching onions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sow multiple seeds per plug. And that's because when you think about it, when you buy these scallions in the supermarket or the grocery store, they usually come in bunches. And so I'm going to grow them together so that I can just pull up a bunch when they're ready. So I'm probably going to sow between 6 and 8 seeds per plug. These little propagators are great because you can keep the humidity inside by putting the lid on, and that really helps speed up germination. It helps to keep the seeds moist. And there's a tray that the seed tray sits in so that the water doesn't run all the way through. But there are so many different containers that you can use to create the same effect, like containers that you would get roast chicken in, one of the rotisserie chickens, cake trays, all kinds of things. I actually have a video on that, so I'll link it below. I'm just going to pop these on the shelf next to the other onions.
As I said earlier, make sure that you mark your seeds with a little planting tag. These ones you can buy in bulk on Amazon, or you can use something like a popsicle stick just to keep track of which seeds are planted in which trays. And then also mark the date of sowing and then transfer that information onto a planting calendar as well. Lastly, onion seeds do not need light to germinate. I only have my lights on because of my geraniums growing on the shelf below. You should see germination in about 7 to 14 days, and no heat requirement is needed either, as they will germinate from anything around 45 degrees up. If you would like to see the video I have on my seed starting setup, I will link that in the description box below. And until next time, thanks for watching.